Somewhere out in space live the Herculoids. Igu, the giant rock ape. Zuck, the laser ray dragon. Gloop and Gleep, the formless, fearless wonders. Tundro, the tremendous. With Xandor, their leader, and his wife Tara, and son Dorno. All strong, all brave, all heroes. They're the Herculoids.
Listen up. I need to tell you about a cartoon that absolutely dominated Saturday mornings in 1967, made millions of kids lose their minds over laser-shooting dragons and rock apes, and then just vanished. Like, completely disappeared from TV for over a decade. I'm talking about the Herculoids. And the reason it got pulled off the air? It had nothing to do with ratings. In fact, the show was crushing it. But here's the thing. Someone decided that kids were watching too much violence. And that decision changed Saturday morning cartoons forever. So if you grew up in the late 60s or caught the reruns in the early 80s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The Herculoids was that show where a family and their alien creature buddies just absolutely wrecked every robot, mutant, and mad scientist that tried to invade their planet. No mercy. Just pure, beautiful, animated chaos. But here's what most people don't know. This wasn't just some random cartoon that came and went. The Herculoids was designed by one of the greatest comic book artists of all time. It rode the wave of the biggest action cartoon boom in TV history. And then it got caught in a moral panic so intense that it basically killed an entire genre of kids programming. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the full story, how the Herculoids became a phenomenon, why it disappeared, and how it somehow came back from the dead in the 80s. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to understand why this show matters way more than you think. The rise, the golden age of action cartoons. Alright, so picture this. It's 1966. Batman is absolutely exploding on TV with Adam West. Kids everywhere are obsessed with superheroes and action. And the networks are looking at this and thinking, how do we get a piece of this? Enter Fred Silverman, the head of daytime programming at CBS. This guy was a genius. He saw that Space Ghost was killing it on Saturday mornings, and he basically said, give me more of that. Give me a whole block of action cartoons. So CBS commissioned what they called the Super Adventure Block. And this wasn't just one show. This was Shazam, Moby Dick, and Mighty Miter, and the crown jewel, the Herculoids. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Hanna-Barbera was the studio making all these shows, and they brought in this guy named Alex Toth to design them. If you're not familiar with that name, let me put it this way. This dude worked on Green Lantern and All-Star Comics at DC. He was a legend in the comic book world. And his design philosophy was basically less is more. Clean lines, bold shapes, maximum impact with minimal detail. And that's exactly what he did with the Herculoids. The show premiered on September 9th, 1967, and it was unlike anything else on TV. The premise was simple, but brilliant. There's this family, Xandor, Tara, and their son, Dorno, living on a planet called Amzot. It's this wild, prehistoric-looking world with jungles and rock formations. And they've got 5 massive creature companions who help them defend the planet from invaders. Let me break down these creatures, because they were insane. Zoc was this dragon that could fly through space and shoot laser beams out of his eyes and tail. He also had this thing called Negabeam eye rays and could breathe fire. Basically, he was a Swiss Army knife of destruction. Igu was a rock ape. Just this massive, indestructible gorilla made of living rock. You could hit him with anything. Lasers, explosions, whatever. And he'd just shrug it off. Plus, he was strong enough to throw boulders like they were baseballs. Tundra was a 10-legged space rhinoceros that could shoot explosive energy rocks out of his horn. And his horn could also spin like a drill. Because why not? And then there were Gloop and Gleep, these 2 protoplasmic blob creatures that could shapeshift into anything. They were basically indestructible and could absorb energy blasts. Gloop was the big one. Gleep was the little one. And they made these weird trilling sounds that every kid tried to imitate. Now here's what made the Herculoids so different from other cartoons. Xandor and his family were basically space barbarians. They rejected technology. Their weapons? Slingshots. That's it. Meanwhile, every villain who showed up had robots, ray guns, and spaceships. And every single episode, This family and their creatures would just wreck these high-tech invaders using nothing but skill and raw power. It was David versus Goliath every week, except David had a laser dragon and a rock ape. The episodes were only 11 minutes long, so the pacing was insane. You'd get an intro, a threat would show up, and then it was just non-stop action until the bad guys were defeated. No filler, no long explanations, just pure, concentrated Saturday morning adrenaline. And the writing? That was handled by Joe Ruby and Ken Spears, the same guys who would go on to create Scooby-Doo. So yeah, these guys knew what they were doing. But here's the thing that really made the Herculoids special. Alex Toth's design work. This show looked incredible for limited animation. Toth used negative space and lighting in ways that most TV animators didn't even think about. Every character had a clear silhouette. You could tell who was who even in shadow. And the creatures weren't just cool looking. They were designed with specific functions in mind. Zoc was sleek and aerodynamic for space travel. Egu was blocky and monolithic to show he was a tank. Gloop and Gleep were fluid and organic to contrast with the rigid mechanical designs of the villains. Plus, the music was incredible. Ted Nichols composed this eerie, theremin-infused score that made Amzot feel truly alien. Combined with the Hanna-Barbera sound effects library, those iconic ray blast sounds and heavy footsteps, the show just worked. The Herculoids was a hit. It was part of a highly rated Saturday morning block. Kids loved it. Parents didn't complain. Everything was going great. And then, 1968 happened. The fall. The moral panic. Okay, so here's where things get dark. And I mean that literally. This is about one of the most intense cultural shifts in American TV history. In 1968, two major assassinations rocked the country. Martin Luther King Jr. in April, and Robert F. Kennedy in June. The nation was already dealing with Vietnam, civil rights protests, and massive social upheaval. And suddenly, people started asking a really uncomfortable question. Is violence in media making our society more violent? Now, if you're thinking, wait, didn't we just go through this same debate with video games in the 90s? Yeah, exactly. This is where it started. Lyndon B. Johnson formed the Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. Advocacy groups started targeting TV networks, and the biggest target? Saturday morning cartoons. There was this group called Action for Children's Television, ACT for short, and they went hard on the networks. They called action cartoons like the Herculoids shrunken adult programming and demanded they be removed from the airwaves. They argued that kids couldn't tell the difference between fantasy violence and real violence, and that watching Xandor and his creatures blithely murdering space pirates was setting a dangerous precedent. Now let me be clear, the Herculoids was bloodless. Nobody died on screen. The bad guys would get knocked out, or their robots would explode, and that was it. But that didn't matter. The perception was that action cartoons were too violent, and the networks caved. By 1969, the Herculoids was pulled from the air. Not because of bad ratings. The show was doing great. Not because of production costs, but because of political pressure. And it wasn't just the Herculoids. Pretty much every action-adventure cartoon from the mid-60s got axed. Space Ghost, Johnny Quest, all of them. Gone. What replaced them? Well, the networks called it the golden age of non-violence. Critics and producers called it something else. Junk. See, the problem was that when you remove conflict from storytelling, you remove drama. And when you remove drama, you remove the reason people watch in the first place. So Saturday mornings became filled with these weird, toothless cartoons where nothing really happened. Musical comedies. Educational shows that were more lecture than entertainment. And here's the kicker. A lot of the action cartoons from the 60s were pulled from reruns entirely. You couldn't even watch them in syndication. It was like they'd been erased from TV history. For over a decade, the Herculoids was basically gone. If you wanted to remember it, you had to rely on your own memories, or maybe find some old comic books. There was no home video, no streaming. It just disappeared. But then, something interesting happened in the early 80s. The Return, Space Stars, and the 1981 revival. So it's 1981, and for the kids who grew up with the original Herculoids, this was a big deal. NBC announced they were bringing the show back as part of an anthology series called Space Stars. Now, if you're thinking, oh cool, they brought back the original show. Not exactly. This was different. First off, the episodes were only 6 minutes long. half the length of the originals. So right away, you're getting a more compressed, faster-paced version of the show. Second, they added a narrator, which, if you remember the original, was completely unnecessary. The original Herculoids didn't need someone explaining what was happening. You could just watch it and understand. But I guess by 1981, networks thought kids needed more hand-holding. And here's the weirdest change. They renamed the planet. In the original, it was called Amzot. In the 1981 version, Quasar. Nobody knows why. There's no explanation in the show's lore. It's just a different planet now, I guess? The original voice cast came back. Mike Road as Xandor, Virginia Gregg as Tara, but they recast Dorno with a new actor named Sparky Marcus. And the whole vibe of the show was just slightly off. It felt more routine, less visceral. Part of this was because Hanna-Barbera's production quality had declined by the early 80s. They were churning out shows on an assembly line, and it showed. The animation wasn't as sharp. The stories felt more formulaic. And even though they tried to maintain the original tone, it just didn't have the same punch. But here's what was interesting about the Space Stars version. It was part of this larger anthology that included Space Ghost and a new show called Teen Force. And occasionally, the shows would cross over. So you'd get episodes where the Herculoids would team up with Space Ghost, which was pretty cool. The 1981 revival lasted for 11 new episodes. Not a huge run, but it was enough to introduce the Herculoids to a new generation of kids, including me. And even though the revival wasn't as good as the original, it kept the brand alive. It reminded people that this show existed, and that mattered, because by the 90s and 2000s, the Herculoids started getting a second life in a completely unexpected way. The legacy, cult status, and modern influence. So here's where things get really interesting. By the time I was old enough to actually appreciate the Herculoids in the late 80s and early 90s, the show had become this weird cult artifact. It wasn't on TV anymore, but people remembered it. And the internet was just starting to become a thing, so suddenly you had all these forums and early websites where people were talking about these old cartoons. And then Cartoon Network launched in 1992, and they started airing all these classic Hanna-Barbera shows, including the Herculoids. So suddenly, a whole new generation got to see what we'd been talking about. But the real cultural resurgence came from Adult Swim. Shows like Space Ghost Coast to Coast and Harvey Birdman Attorney at Law took these old Hanna-Barbera characters and repurposed them for comedy. And the Herculoids showed up in a few episodes. There's this one episode of Space Ghost Coast to Coast where Space Ghost visits the Herculoids planet and calls it a rotten hippie monster commune, which honestly is pretty accurate. They do live off the grid and reject technology. They're basically the ultimate preppers. But beyond the parodies, the Herculoids actually influenced a lot of creators. David Crane, the designer of the video game A Boy and His Blob, explicitly said that Gloop and Gleep were his direct inspiration. The show's blend of biological fantasy and high-tech conflict predated similar themes in Star Trek and Star Wars by several years. And in 2021, the Herculoids made a cameo appearance in Space Jam: A New Legacy. Egu, Gloop, and Gleep showed up as CG spectators in the crowd, which is wild when you think about it. A show from 1967 is still recognizable enough to get a cameo in a major Hollywood movie over 50 years later. And here's the most recent development. In February 2025, Dynamite Entertainment announced they're launching the first ever dedicated Herculoids comic book series, written by Tom Snagowski, with variant covers by Mike Mignola, the guy who created Hellboy. This is the first time the franchise has headlined its own monthly title in over 50 years. The series is going to explore the origins of the family and the world of Amzot, filling in all those narrative gaps that the original show never addressed. Because, let's be honest, the 1967 show didn't really care about backstory. It was just, here's a family, here are their creatures, here are some bad guys, go. But now, in 2025, we're finally getting that deeper lore, which is pretty cool for those who grew up with this show. So, why does any of this matter? Why should you care about a cartoon that got canceled over 50 years ago? Because the Herculoids is a perfect case study in how creative works can be destroyed by political and social forces that have nothing to do with quality. This wasn't a bad show. It wasn't failing. It was a high watermark of artistic achievement in limited animation, driven by Alex Toth's incredible design work and Hanna-Barbera's production muscle. But it got caught in a cultural shift that prioritized nonviolence over storytelling. And the result was that an entire generation of kids got stuck with watered-down, boring cartoons that didn't challenge them or excite them. And here's the thing. The Herculoids survived. It didn't die. It went underground, became a cult classic, and eventually came back. Not in the same form, but it came back. That's the power of good design and good storytelling. Even when the censors and advocacy groups try to erase something, if it's good enough, it finds a way to persist. It ferments in the cultural consciousness. It gets passed down from generation to generation. And that feeling, that pure, unfiltered excitement, is what the Herculoids represents. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest ideas are the most powerful. A family. They're creatures, defending their home. That's it. That's the whole show. But it worked. It worked so well that it outlasted the censors, outlasted the moral panic, and outlasted the networks that tried to bury it. So if you've never seen the Herculoids, go find it. It's out there. And if you have seen it, go watch it again. Because it holds up. The design is still incredible. The action is still exciting. And the core idea that you don't need fancy technology to be a hero, you just need courage and loyalty, is timeless. All right, that's the full story of the Herculoids. From its rise in the golden age of action cartoons, to its fall during the moral panic of the late 60s, to its resurrection in the 80s, and its cult status today. Thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into the cartoons that shaped our childhoods, and I'll see you in the next one.